Hey y'all, it's Laura, and for today's A Cherry on Top video, we're going to be doing a Technique Tuesday hand-stitched titling. So I have printed out a title that I'm going to use on this blue background with the black thread, and then I have an alphabet, and I'm going to use this to spell my title on the grid paper. So let's dive in and I'll show you how I'm going to do each of these. So for the first layout, I have this beautiful sky blue background, and I'm going to bring my printed paper to the bottom here where I want this large title to go. It is a good idea to plan out your layout, at least in your mind, to know where your photos are going to go and how your title will fit around them. So in this case, I'm going to be creating a layout with one 4x6 that stands just above the I am with you section of the title, and so I've already measured that out, and I am going to use this little paper piercer and create little holes along the lines of the scripty font always. And I'm not too worried about some areas being thicker than others because I'm just looking for that cursive font, not necessarily the calligraphy part of it. So now I'm just about done poking in all of the holes, and then I will begin my stitching. Now I am using DMC 310 thread, and that is their black color, and it will stand out quite nicely on this background. As you can see, you can already tell my title is fully in place, and I'm just going to thread my needle and just start following it with a simple back stitch all the way throughout the word always. I will occasionally skip forward a couple of stitches just to stay with the cursive line, because like with the A at the beginning, you go up and then back. Well, when you're doing a back stitch, that doesn't really work. You'd be overlapping your stitching, and some areas would be double stitched. So instead I will, and you'll see just a second, I skip ahead a couple of stitches, skip a couple of holes, and then come back to it when I come back around the A, so that I don't actually end up double stitching any of those letters. I won't make you watch the entire thing. I just want to give you a quick idea of how this technique works, and I find it very effective, especially for a large title on your page. I think having that stitching adds a lot of texture and dimension, and it's just something a little bit special. It's a detail that makes the layout just a little bit more interesting and catches your eye when you're flipping through an album and you see a hand stitched layout. For me at least, that does definitely catch my eye. So here now I am skipping ahead just one stitch. So I've skipped a stitch and then I've made a stitch. I'm going to skip a stitch and then make a stitch. And that way, when I come backward with the other half of the A, it will be easier to do so. There we go. So skipping ahead to get the top curve done, and then I will come back in those empty stitches, which will bring me to the other side of the A without having to double stitch or without having a giant piece of thread across the back of your layout where you have jumped across the page. So again, I won't make you watch the entire stitching process. I just wanted to leave in enough to give you an idea of how to do a simple back stitch for this word. You could use a chain stitch if you like, but it will be a much thicker braided look, and I would use less threads for that. I have all 6 of the floss threads together on this one to create a nice thick black line. But if you were doing a thicker or more complicated stitch, I would use probably half. So just three of the threads should do it. So now that I have this completely stitched, I am going to go ahead and tie off the end and do quite a few knots, enough that it's secured to the back. There we go. So just look at that texture. Is that not lovely? So even though I don't have the thick lines of the calligraphy, like in the original, it still has the feeling. So here is the finished layout using that title. I did include the finished layout for both of my techniques. Next up, we're going to be using this cross stitch pattern to create a short word title, home. And so I am looking at the pattern and counting how many X's for each section of the letter, and then creating 4 holes around each of the squares in this grid paper. Using grid paper is a huge time saver, and makes it a lot easier to do this neatly. I would suggest getting a very small, thin grid paper, so not big boxes, but small boxes, and I find that is much, much easier to use. So in this case, I believe it had 9 crosses down for each end of the H. And so that's what I'm doing, is I'm counting, making sure I have 9 boxes with 4 corners all pierced. That way when I come in with my thread, I can just create X's over those boxes in my cross-stitching design. Now, this did take a little bit of time to get just right, and I was referring to the pattern quite a lot just to make sure that I was counting correctly. But in the end, it's such a cool look, and the font is really, really fun, especially using a nice bright red thread on this white and gray background. So here it is complete, all paper pierced into the word home, and I'm holding it up to see if you can see it. It's a little hard to see on the white grid paper, but again, you can see how small that grid is. That was really helpful to use a small grid. I am using number 349 from the DMC thread. That is a pretty true red, and worked pretty well for the collection I was playing with for this one. Again, I'm going to use all 6 strands of the thread so that I can get a nice thick line for my wording. Now, if you were using a smaller word or fewer boxes, and it was just a smaller, thinner area, you could probably use less thread, but because I want a big, bold statement on the page, I'm choosing to use all 6. So, a couple of things to keep in mind with a cross-stitch title. One, you want to continue to cross your threads the same way every time to get a nice, clean look. So if you start from the top left corner and go to the bottom right corner of each box, and then go to the top right, down to the top left, continue that pattern all the way through. Otherwise, it can make them look very disjointed, and sometimes they get a little bumpy where some are higher than others. However, I find if you stick with the same pattern that you start with, it's nice and smooth and just looks so much neater. So I'm just going through all of these little boxes I've created and making X's. I believe it had 3 across the top for that little hooked part of the H that is at both the top and the bottom. That gives a little bit of flair to that font. And then coming in and doing the lines going all the way down. I just did the first column of the H on camera just to give you an idea of how that works. Just to keep in mind too, your thread may get tangled. I had to fight with mine a little bit on this one because I had pulled such a long piece. If you're finding that you're fighting with thread getting tangled up in the back a lot, you could use smaller pieces. You just have to tie them off and get out new thread more often. And I tend to be a little too impatient for that. So I tend to use longer pieces of thread and just deal with fighting the tangles that you get in the back because that's just part of sewing. So cross stitching is really, really easy. Once you get the hang of it, it goes very quickly, and having the pattern paper pierced in the background really helps you to move through the pattern quickly. Whereas if you were doing this on Aida cloth, which is what you normally cross stitch on, it has the boxes, the entire cloth is boxes already pierced for you. You have to do a lot of counting to decide which boxes to fill and which boxes not to fill. And it does take quite a bit more eye for detail, whereas this one, as long as you've just poked out all of the boxes that you need, you really don't have to think about it, you can just go for it. Now I'm using the same technique on the H that I used on the back stitch earlier, and I did partial stitches coming down the column, and then we'll be going back up with the finishing stitch just to make sure that I'm not double stitching, and so I'm not reaching too far with my thread to get to another section on the page. It would be better to close off the stitch with a knot on the back and then create a new knot somewhere else than to stretch your thread across the piece. Now here is the finished stitching home. I think it turned out pretty darn cute. This is the layout that I created with home, and that's it for Technique Tuesday. Hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe. Until next time, bye!